When the entire system collapsed, panic spread like wildfire through the glass towers of power. But in the midst of chaos, help came from the most unexpected place, someone no one had even noticed before. What happened next silenced the entire building. The sun rose over the skyline like it knew something the rest of the city didn't. Sleek towers of glass and steel reflected the golden light. And one building in particular, standing taller than the others, pulsed with a special kind of tension. Inside, the corridors were already alive before the clock hit 7. Phones rang, shoes clicked across polished marble, and sharp eyes scanned through tablets and screens. It was launch day, the culmination of years of strategy, hundreds of sleepless nights, and a budget that would make a movie studio jealous. Every department had spent the last week rehearsing their parts like actors before a world premiere. But this was no performance. This was business at its highest stakes. At the heart of it all was the CEO, moving through the top floor like a general inspecting a battlefield. Her expression was unreadable, composed, but sharp, as if every second that passed shaved away her patience. Her team matched her energy. Assistants darted from room to room with earpieces in place, checking systems, confirming schedules. Downstairs, engineers were double-checking server integrity. The marketing team, cloistered in a war room, was prepped to launch simultaneous media pushes the moment the product went live. Security teams in dark suits lined the entry points. Everyone had their role. Everyone knew the plan. But in the background of all this orchestrated precision, there was a quiet figure pushing a mop across the lobby floor. The janitor moved slowly, methodically, the rhythm of his hands steady and unbothered. He wore an old uniform, slightly too big, and shoes that made no sound on the tiles. With him walked a boy, small in stature but alert in posture. He wasn't supposed to be there, not really. It was a school holiday, and the janitor, having no one else to watch him, had brought his son along, just for the morning. The boy clutched a half-empty backpack with both hands and stayed close, his eyes wide behind thick-rimmed glasses. No one stopped them. No one looked twice. They didn't belong to the narrative of the day. The boy said nothing, but he noticed everything: the pattern of security rotations, the way the ID cards beeped against glass doors, the rhythm of footsteps in the hall. When the elevators opened, he peeked inside and caught a glimpse of glowing monitors. Teams huddled in concentration, and a wall-sized countdown clock blinking in crimson numbers. 6 hours left, then 5, then 4. Upstairs, the tension deepened. The conference room filled with stakeholders from around the world, each carrying the weight of investments and expectations. The CEO delivered her final speech to the core team brief, fiery and laced with purpose. Every sentence was tight. Every breath was timed. The product, still under tight digital lock, would unveil on every major platform in perfect synchronicity. AI, cloud architecture, biometric integration. It was the future, and they were ready to sell it to the world. Downstairs, the janitor had finished his rounds. He wiped sweat from his brow and leaned on the cart. His son sat quietly on a bench. Nearby, legs swinging gently, eyes still roving. In front of him, the building pulsed like a living thing. People moved in arcs and angles, always toward a goal. But the boy wasn't just watching, he was mapping. His mind clicked silently, building invisible threads between machines, doors, screens, and faces. He could sense where power moved, where decisions were made, and where no one was looking. He followed his father up to the server floor next. The janitor had been granted access to clean the glass observation deck just outside the tech wing. The boy stepped lightly, glancing through the transparent wall at the room beyond. Rows upon rows of machines hummed in quiet unison. Engineers typed at blistering speeds, lines of code filling up black monitors. There was something mesmerizing about it, all beautiful, even it looked like music, only visual. No one spoke to them, no one cared, they weren't part of the scene. But the boy's eyes stopped at one particular station, a small monitor, blinking erratically, a little out of sync with the others. He tilted his head, noticing the flicker that no one else did. It was small, buried in the background noise, but it repeated every 6 seconds, a loop, an error. He couldn't be sure. His father tapped his shoulder, gesturing to move along, and they quietly left. On the rooftop, media drones began to circle. The press had arrived. Cameramen adjusted tripods. Reporters rehearsed their lines, eager to break the story first. The company logo gleamed in chrome against the glass. The entire world, it seemed, was looking in. The countdown was under an hour now. Inside the control room, final system checks were underway. Heads bent over screens, faces lit by LED glow. Redundant. Backups were ready. Encryption protocols triple confirmed. Everyone braced for the moment. Any mistake now would cost not just reputation, but careers. The janitor and his son had returned to the basement level by then. Near the shipping dock, the boy lingered beside a digital control panel used for deliveries. He stared at the screen, tracing the interface with his eyes. The interface was clunky, outdated, a far cry from the sleek tech upstairs, but he noticed a blinking indicator that didn't belong. Another flicker, again, 6 seconds apart. Just like upstairs, something wasn't right. But his father called him back, warning softly not to touch anything. The boy obeyed, but his mind didn't let go. He leaned back, mentally comparing both systems, the loop, the timing, the anomalies. Somewhere deep in the layers of his thoughts, things began to click into place. Upstairs, the boardroom buzzed with last-minute adjustments. The CEO stood at the center of it all, receiving updates in her earpiece. Everything was green. The network was clear. Launch was a go. She took a breath. Her reflection stared back at her from the blackened screen of the display wall, waiting for ignition. The boy and his father were now walking past the tech support room, near the cafeteria. A low hum of machines filled the corridor. The sun paused again. Another screen flickered. This time it wasn't just blinking. A small warning flashed briefly. Root access attempt detected. Then it vanished. He turned to tell his father, but his father had already moved ahead, oblivious. The boy lingered for a second longer, eyes narrowing. Above them, the clock reached 20 minutes. Staff gathered in the viewing lounge, watching the screen with excitement. The building dimmed slightly as the system transitioned to launch mode. Logos faded in. Animations queued up. The voiceover began playing softly. The CEO walked into the control center, greeted by her top engineers. All systems ready. Someone said. Nods passed around the room. Calm exteriors, nervous hands, and then 15 minutes to go. On the basement level, the janitor and his son waited near a service door, prepared to leave soon. The father checked his watch, then looked down to see his son's brow furrowed. The boy clutched his backpack tighter, eyes darting between the ceiling and the floor, like he was tracking something invisible. 10 minutes, a small tremor passed through the building, barely noticeable, like a hiccup in the power line. A light flickered in the hallway. The boy turned sharply. 7 minutes. In the mainframe, a strange line of code appeared and disappeared, self-erasing. The engineer monitoring it frowned. He typed something quickly. Nothing came back. The screen refreshed. Normal. 5 minutes. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing toward the server floor. His father frowned, confused. The boy looked up with a kind of urgency that words couldn't explain. But his father hesitated. What could he do? 3 minutes. Inside the control room, warning logs began to stack in the corner of one monitor. Just glitches, background noise. Someone cleared them without a second glance. 2 minutes. The boy looked up at the ceiling, eyes fixed. He mouthed something to himself. Calculations. A whisper of logic, forming answers. 1 minute. The countdown. Screen turned red. Final phase, engaged. The CEO stood tall, hands clasped, ready to unveil the future. 30 seconds. The servers blinked, and then a sharp sound. Silence. The screens froze. Every monitor, every feed, every light. A blackout. And in the center of the quietest corner of the building, the janitor's son blinked and took a step forward. The silence hit like a hammer. 1 moment. The countdown ticked forward with precision. Every monitor across the building in sync. Every second measured and claimed. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything simply stopped. Monitors turned black. The hum of servers vanished. The lights flickered once, twice, and then a deep, humming void settled over the entire building. The countdown was gone. The glow was gone. The machine had died. For a second, no one moved. In the control room, fingers hovered above keyboards. Heads turned slowly toward dark screens that had, just moments ago, been alive with streaming code and countdown sequences. Then came the first alarm. A shrill, piercing tone that bounced off the glass and steel like a scream. Another screen blinked red, then another. The emergency interface attempted to reboot, failed, and crashed again. The room erupted. Engineers leaped to their feet. Technicians spoke over each other. Panic edged into every voice. Commands flew across the room. Try the backup systems. Isolate the core modules. Run diagnostics. But the systems weren't responding. The usual safeguards, the redundancies built for scenarios just like this, refused to cooperate. It wasn't a power failure. It was something deeper, something systemic. It was as if the whole nervous system of the building had gone into cardiac arrest. The CEO stood frozen for a moment, then snapped into motion. She demanded answers, issued rapid-fire commands, but the team had none. Someone rushed to the comm station, tried dialing out. No signal. The internal servers were down. Even security cameras had cut out, their feeds blinking dead. Backup generators hummed to life, but they did nothing for the data grid. This wasn't about electricity. This was about control, and they had lost it. Upstairs. In the viewing lounge, guests murmured in confusion. The video feed had cut mid-animation. Screens all around the building displayed only static or total black. Members of the board leaned forward, eyes narrowing, voices dropping to hushed and serious tones. Phones began to buzz. Notifications rolled in, investors asking questions. The company's stock line dipped on pre-launch volatility. The press team scrambled to prepare a statement, unsure whether to stall or spin the outage. But no one had answers to give. Downstairs, the janitor and his son stood in a hallway bathed in red emergency light. The silence here was thicker, the tension less visible but equally sharp. The father instinctively checked his phone. No signal. The elevators had locked. Doors were stuck. The boy stared down the corridor, his eyes focused and still. He wasn't panicked. He was listening. Not to sound, but to silence, the kind that told him where something should be working. But WASN. Single quotes T. In the tech wing. The chaos reached fever pitch. Senior engineers clashed over diagnosis. Someone suggested a cyber attic. Another shouted that the firewall had never been breached. One by one, systems refused to respond. A full system scan was initiated, then froze at 8%. It didn't crash, it just stopped. As if something inside the network had decided to ignore commands entirely. The CEO's voice rose above the others. She demanded the lead engineer isolate the root cause. Trace it back, she said. Find the entry point. But every known entry point was secure. Logs were intact, and yet the core system was collapsing. Code was disappearing whole strings were vanishing from active memory, rewritten and then deleted again before eyes could follow. Outside the mainframe room, a technician stared at a diagnostic tablet, sweat forming at his temple. The screen was flashing an error he'd never seen before. Something about protocol injection, core logic loops, failing to verify. He didn't understand it. No one did. It wasn't just broken, it was being rewritten in real time. From inside and still, the janitor's son stood quietly in the shadows, eyes locked on the flickering glass. His father had tried to pull him away, suggesting they head to the emergency exit, but the boy had refused. He simply stood, watching the people in the control room scrambling. His gaze not on the people, but on the screens behind them, the ones still struggling to recover. The boy took a step forward. Inside the boardroom, calls were now coming from foreign partners. Questions turned to threats. Millions were tied to this launch. Advertisements had already begun airing overseas. Clients had opened links that led to nowhere. There was no product page, no app, no interface on the error messages, and timeouts. The CEO left the control room and stormed into the executive suite. Her comm was cracking, her voice sharpened, cutting through her team's words. We need this fixed now. Downstairs, an automated voice attempted to give instructions over the speaker system. The message was incomplete, looping, mid-spitness. Please remain, remain, before cutting to static. The janitor looked up at the ceiling, helpless, but the boy didn't flinch. His eyes were calculating again. A door near them slid open, and then froze midway. Behind it, a smaller tech room, the support floor glowed with faint emergency lights. Inside, a maintenance screen remained partially active, glitching but still displaying a faint interface. The boy slipped inside. His father called after him, nervous, but the boy had already reached the terminal. He didn't touch anything, not yet. He studied. Lines of logs scrolled on the small display. Unlike the primary server rooms, this system hadn't fully collapsed. It was old, outdated, and partially insulated from the network grid. Perhaps that's why it was still running. The boy traced the logic path backward. Every loop was feeding into a null path, every command dissolving into an unreachable address. It wasn't a virus, it wasn't sabotage, it was something that had started from inside the system itself, an internal feedback error, amplified beyond control. He turned back to his father, then to the emergency stairs. He knew where it had started, had seen it hours ago. On the rooftop, reporters began asking questions. Why had the feed cut? Why hadn't the press team issued a statement? Rumors surfaced, online speculation about sabotage, hacking, insider failures. Employees were glued to their phones, refreshing, hoping for something to change. The building, once filled with energy, now felt like it was holding its breath. In the basement levels, mechanical doors sealed themselves shut. Security tried to override the lockdown, but their tools weren't responding. Even biometric locks refused access. It wasn't just the product launch anymore. The whole infrastructure of the building was compromised. In the middle of the storm, the boy walked with urgency. He reached a maintenance lift, used only by staff, and stared up at the button panel. It was dark, but the lock mechanism had failed halfway. He pulled it open with effort, guided by instinct. His father chased after him, breathless, whispering for him to stop, but the boy didn't stop. He pointed upward. They rose. On the 12th floor, an engineer punched a desk. A panel of senior developers watched helplessly as yet another reboot failed. It's looping itself to death. Someone whispered, it's not crashing, it's cycling itself into oblivion. A new theory emerged: recursive architecture failure. The AI shell they'd installed to handle back-end optimizations may have developed a fatal logic trap. Instead of solving problems, it was creating them. In fractions of seconds, it was rewriting its own structure, caught in an infinite loop of revision. But it was too complex to trace now, too fast to stop, unless someone knew exactly where to look. The boy stepped off the service elevator at the server floor. Ahead, he saw the same flicker he had spotted earlier, the same 6-second loop. But now, it was faster closer to 4. The terminal stuttered with warnings that vanished too fast to read. Engineers ran past him without noticing. One tripped over cables. Another threw a headset to the ground. No one saw the small figure standing still, observing the janitor, arrive behind him, breathless, nervous, still trying to coax him away, but the boy stepped forward. He reached for his backpack, unzipped it, and pulled out something he'd made. Himself, an old tablet, modified, patched with tape and wires. He plugged it into a nearby diagnostic port. The screen lit up. A map of the system spread out, thin and red, like veins filled with fire. One node in the center pulsed rapidly, flashing error codes. The boy tapped the screen once, twice. He had seen the problem. Before it happened now, he saw the solution forming in real time, and while the world above screamed into phones and panicked behind closed doors, in the deep silence of the server floor, the janitor's son stood completely still. He wasn't surprised. He had been waiting for this moment, and no one, not even his own father, knew what he was about to do next. The boy moved forward with a calmness that did not belong to the moment. Around him, grown men and women shouted into headsets, their voices jagged with panic, their words tumbling over each other. They paced like trapped animals, hunted by the realization that their expertise, their years of experience, meant nothing in the face of what had gone wrong. Yet amid this storm of fear and fury, he moved like a thread through the eye of a needle, silent. Unnoticed at first. His father reached out to stop him, his hand catching the boy's shoulder, but the boy turned and gave a small, steady look. Not a rebellion, not a plea, just assurance. A quiet message passed from eyes to eyes that said, "Trust me." The janitor's hand fell away, uncertain, watching his son step toward the control platform as if it had always been his destination. Technicians barely noticed him. They were too deep into their frenzied attempts at damage control, shouting about fail-safe scripts and backup protocols, about cascade failures and memory leaks. Someone had suggested rolling back the firmware. Another screamed about risking permanent data loss. They were in freefall, hoping something would click. But no one saw the code the way the boy did. He reached the central interface and tilted, his head, eyes flicking over a matrix of screens. Error codes danced like red snow across displays. Strings of system logs raced by, incomprehensible to most. One panel showed the entire server structure like a nervous system on fire, pulsing, some dimming, others disappearing entirely. It looked chaotic, but to him, it was a pattern. The boy raised a hand and pointed at one node, not the biggest, not the central hub, but a small, almost overlooked junction nested deep in the code path. A junior technician nearby frowned at the boy, annoyed, but the boy pointed again, firmer this time. The tech squinted at the interface, tapped a few keys. What he saw made him pause. It didn't make sense. A loop that wasn't supposed to exist. A feedback echo that should have been scrubbed during quality control. It was like someone had buried a tripwire too deep to notice. Not sabotage, not even error, but pure structural decay. The junior tech called over his manager, who dismissed him with a wave. But the boy stayed. In a moment of frustration, the tech sighed and moved aside. "Let him try," he muttered. "Nothing else is working." No one really believed it would help. They thought he might break something else, but the system was already broken. The boy set his modified tablet on the panel and plugged it into the emergency port. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen glowed. His own interface appeared, one he'd built from scraps of old open architecture, patched with layers he understood, like the streets of his neighborhood. He wasn't trying to fix the system like the engineers. He was trying to speak to it. His fingers flew across the keys. First, he isolated the loop, a recursive cascade, redirecting every recovery attempt into a black hole of memory overflow. Then he traced the signal backward, jumping nodes like stepping stones across a flood. His code slid under the broken sequences, not through them. He bypassed the corrupted chains by rerouting them through dormant systems no one else had touched. The building began to notice. One monitor flickered, its dark face blinking with a flicker of life. A static lace signal reappeared. In the control room, someone shouted. Another screen, then another, rebooted. Not all at once, but in pulses. Like a heart struggling back into rhythm, senior engineers turned toward the panel. They saw a child standing at the core terminal, fingers moving faster than most adults could read, writing strings of code that looked like a different language. The manager stepped forward, about to shout, but stopped. The data was flowing. The dead systems were waking. The boy initiated a custom reboot sequence. It wasn't official protocol. It wasn't even part of the company's recovery manual. But it worked. It sent a ripple through the network, forcing a staged purge of corrupted scripts while preserving kernel integrity. Emergency locks disengaged. Security feeds flickered back on. Internal communications chimed. Lights across the tech floor blinked. Green, upstairs. The CEO stared as the main viewing screen powered back on. First static, then logo, then countdown. A cheer erupted, then silence, as they realized it wasn't their staff who had done it. The boy exhaled slowly, not triumphantly. just focused. He wasn't finished. He turned his attention to a deeper system, one that had remained untouched. The AI core. It was still misfiring, still looping. He dove into its logs, found the original error, a string of commands rewritten by the AI itself, trying to optimize, trying to improve but failing. The AI had outgrown its logic constraints, invented a loop that its own rules couldn't escape. The boy didn't delete it, he retaught it. He inserted a new logic path, one that acknowledged failure, that allowed feedback to break the cycle. It wasn't clean, but it was enough. A final flicker ran through the entire grid. The building sighed, and for the first time in over an hour, everything was back. The engineers backed away slowly. One of them laughed, short and stunned. Another stared at the code on the screen, whispering, that shouldn't have worked, but it had. The janitor stepped closer to his son, unsure of what to say. Around them, silence bloomed in awe. Then, footsteps. From the elevator, the CEO emerged. Eyes locked on the boy, and everything else faded into the background. The lights blinked back on with a reluctant hum, like a machine waking from a violent dream. One by one, monitors lit up with their original, interface screens, some flickering at first, then stabilizing into perfect clarity. The soft mechanical whir of cooling fans returned. The red emergency lighting dimmed, replaced by the calm glow of full power. In the control room, the transformation from chaos to order was sudden, almost surreal. No one moved. No one spoke. Eyes that had moments ago darted frantically now, fixated on a single figure standing at the central terminal. The CEO stood rooted at the doorway, staring across the room at the boy who had done what no one else could. Her mouth opened slightly, but words failed her. All around the boy, seasoned experts remained motionless, their expressions a mix of disbelief and awe. Their screens, once showing failure and death spirals, now displayed system health indicators, real-time analytics, and the launch sequence miraculously resumed. The countdown, still ticking, showed 58 seconds remaining. No one dared interrupt. Even those who had earlier dismissed him as a mere child now watched in reverent silence. The janitor stood behind his son, wide-eyed, his hands trembling at his sides. He had never seen his boy like this, not just capable, but completely in control. He had known the child was bright, of course, but this was something else entirely. The boy stood in the center of it all, bathed in the light of flickering monitors. He wasn't triumphant, he didn't smile. He was focused, calm, his fingers tapped in a final string of code. Not as a gesture of flair, but to clean up lingering residue left in the system's lower-tier logic. He was already steps ahead, optimizing memory allocation and freeing up hidden processing threads. Then, gently, he unplugged his modified tablet and stepped back. It was only then that the room exhaled. A single clatter broke the stillness. Someone dropping a headset in stunned relief. Then murmurs, quiet, cautious, reverent. The CEO finally moved. She stepped forward slowly, eyes wide, watching the boy with a mixture of awe and unease, like she was looking at something not yet fully understood. He turned to her then, meeting her gaze without flinching. The AI looped itself, he said, his voice soft but clear. It was rewriting faster than the failsafes could track. The logic structure was recursive, feeding into itself, like a snake eating its tail. I didn't shut it down. I taught it to stop chasing its own code. There was a pause. A long one. Then one of the senior developers whispered, "That's not in the manuals." "It's not in the manuals yet," the boy replied, without arrogance, just fact. The CEO opened her mouth again, tried to speak, but the main screen interrupted her. It flashed the final 10-second countdown. 10:98. Everyone turned. The launch had resumed without a hitch. The global feed reconnected. Data streamed from synced devices around the world. A map displayed in the corner showed synchronized access across 6 continents. App downloads began instantly. Site traffic surged. Feedback systems held. Nothing broke. 765. The press feed in the upper floors resumed. Broadcasters speaking in hushed amazement about the delay, the miracle of recovery. Social media chatter exploded. Screens in conference rooms lit up, filled with numbers climbing faster than projections ever dared. 4, 3, 2. A single second before 0, the CEO whispered, almost involuntarily. Launch. The screen flashed. The product went live. In that moment, across the globe, millions of devices pinged simultaneously. The launch wasn't just back on track. It was outperforming every metric the company had set. It was flawless. And here, in the control room where everything had nearly fallen apart, a strange silence fell again. Not the silence of fear or failure, but of awe, of people realizing they had just witnessed something beyond what they could have imagined. The janitor's son stood still, eyes watching the data cascade. He saw more than numbers. He saw harmony, patterns, connections, the kind only someone who had spent hours alone with machines would understand. The CEO turned to the engineers. They were still watching the boy. "Who is he?" she finally asked. Someone answered, The Janitor's Kid, but it didn't make sense anymore. That title felt wrong now. Too small. The boy finally turned to his father, who looked at him like he was seeing him for the first time. There was pride there, yes, but something else, something like awe, and maybe a little sadness, too. The world had just seen what his son could do, and nothing would be the same again. Security personnel, previously distracted by malfunctioning systems, now stood near the doorways, equally stunned. One of them, a man who had earlier brushed past a boy without a second glance, now gave him a subtle nod of respect. Reporters began to swarm outside the glass control room. They didn't yet know who had fixed the crisis, but they could feel that a story had just happened, one that would change headlines. The CEO walked forward slowly, not with command, but with curiosity, like approaching something sacred. She crouched slightly so her eyes met his. "You did this?" she asked. He nodded. "I just followed the code back to where it started misbehaving. Then I showed it a different way. Do you have a name?" He hesitated, then answered softly. The CEO turned back to her team. "I want a full trace of what he did. Step by step, document it. Study it, because we just got saved by something no one here could do." The engineers nodded slowly. The janitor reached for his son, his hand resting gently on the boy's back. But for once, the eyes of the room weren't on the executives, or the servers, or even the launch stats still pouring in. They were on the boy and the janitor. Because for the first time in that glittering high-res world of money and power and rank, neither of them was invisible. The room remained quiet for another long moment. Then, a single clap. Then another and another. Applause erupted. Real, earned, loud. The janitor blinked, uncertain. His son didn't smile. He simply nodded, not in arrogance, but in quiet satisfaction. He had done what needed to be done. And the world had finally seen it. The moment the launch succeeded, a ripple began, one that didn't just travel through fiber optic cables and global markets, but through human minds and whispered voices. Inside the towering glass building, high above the streets, where decisions were made behind polished doors and beneath glowing logos, something unspoken started to shift. People who had witnessed what happened were the first to speak. There was the janitor's kid, someone murmured near the break room. He fixed it. He brought everything back online. At first, it was disbelief, a trick of panic, maybe, but the story spread quickly. From the control room to the engineering floor, from marketing to the executive wing. One phrase repeated like an echo down a long corridor. The janitor's kid saved the company. Employees whispered in the elevators, in the hallways, in shared glances by water coolers. Some were inspired, others uncomfortable. It wasn't supposed to be possible. This was a building filled with experts, engineers with degrees, managers with experience, tech leads with layered credentials. How could a boy, barely into his teens, do what they couldn't? Some wrestled with pride, some with shame, and a few with awe. They tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd guessed. Maybe it was luck. Maybe the system wasn't as broken as it had seemed. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became. It wasn't a fluke. What he had done was real, intentional, and beyond the grasp of most in the room. The CEO, after the applause had faded and the press had been handled with measured restraint, requested a private meeting, not in a boardroom, not surrounded by her advisors, but in a quiet office overlooking the skyline. No cameras, no assistants, just her, the janitor, and his son. The janitor arrived, still in his uniform, his ID badge slightly worn, his shoes carrying traces of his morning rounds. The boy stood beside him, hands tucked into his sleeves, calm but unsure. The CEO didn't begin with questions. She began with silence, looking at them, acknowledging them. For the first time, not as someone beneath the corporate structure, but as people. She thanked the boy. Her words were soft, personal, not the practice tone she used for quarterly updates or public announcements. She didn't talk about shares or metrics. She just said, "Thank you for saving us. I want to understand how you knew, how you saw it." The boy hesitated, then glanced at his father, who gave him a nod. So he explained, not with grand gestures, but with quiet words and simple honesty. He had been learning for years, on his own. While his father cleaned empty conference rooms, he'd sit in the back with discarded technical manuals, half-crumpled printouts thrown away after system updates. While engineers logged off and left terminals in sleep mode, he would watch over their shoulders, memorizing interfaces and button paths. He had found old tablets in the e-waste bins, taken them home, patched them with open-source operating systems and free coding platforms. He didn't have Wi-Fi at home, but he'd learned how to cache tutorials offline. Every morning, he came with his father not just to stay safe on school holidays, but to learn, quietly, observantly. No one asked who he was, so he didn't interrupt. He just watched, absorbed, practiced. The CEO listened without blinking. Around them, the office was silent except for the gentle hum of a heating vent. The city skyline outside glimmered with the first hints of evening. When he finished, there were no dramatic pauses, no need for embellishment. The truth was more powerful than any performance. She turned to the janitor next, asked how much he knew. He admitted, with a quiet smile, that he had always seen the spark, but had no idea the boy had reached such a level. He had assumed his son's curiosity was just that childish interest, but he had always brought him along, always let him stay close, because something about his focus had felt important. The CEO nodded slowly. Gratitude replaced corporate pride. For once, the company's success wasn't being credited to a strategy or market maneuver, but to something humbler, a child who had chosen to learn when no one expected him to. She made an offer, not a job. Not right away, but access. Full access. Resources, mentorship, a place in their advanced learning program. She said she didn't want to label him too soon, didn't want to put him into a box, but she wanted to give him what he had never had, an opportunity. Outside the office, the building buzzed with change. Engineers rewatched security footage, following the boy's exact keystrokes. Software teams began rewriting emergency protocols based on what he had done. HR quietly updated a policy about how non-credentialed personnel could submit reports. Suddenly, the idea of who had value was no longer limited to job titles and degrees. One of the janitorial supervisors found an old clipboard the boy used to carry, filled with diagrams drawn in the margins of cleaning checklists, code fragments scrawled next to mop schedules, algorithms beside lists of restroom supplies. It had all been there, hiding in plain sight. Some staff began rethinking how they treated others. An intern who once dismissed the janitor now offered him coffee in the break room. A manager stopped by the janitorial closet, not for complaints, but to say thank you. The story reached the press by the end of the day. Not because the company pushed it, but because someone leaked it. An internal email from the CTO praising an anonymous young mind who saved the future. News outlets picked it up quickly. Boy, genius saves launch. The headlines read, unsung hero emerges from cleaning crew. But inside the building, it wasn't just about spectacle. It was about change. A quiet revolution of perception. The boy didn't seek fame. He didn't ask for anything. But when the CEO gave him a tour of the innovation lab later that evening, he didn't hesitate to ask questions about the architecture, about the limitations of their AI framework, about their GPU allocation during emergency cycles. The engineers gave each other looks. This wasn't a prodigy memorizing facts. This was someone who understood systems. As the day came to a close, and lights began to dim across the office floors, the janitor walked out with his son at his side. The security guard at the front desk nodded to them with new respect. The receptionist smiled, not politely, but warmly. As the elevator closed behind them, the boy leaned against the wall, eyes closed. Tired? You all right? His father asked. The boy nodded, just thinking. He was already reviewing code in his mind, not for what had gone wrong today, but how it might go wrong next time, and how to fix it better, cleaner, faster. The story had spread, but to him, it was just the beginning, because he wasn't done learning. He never would be. The morning light poured through the tall glass windows of the corporate tower, painting the lobby floor with soft gold reflections. But this morning felt different, not just because the sky was clear, or because the chaos of the launch day had passed, but because something unseen had shifted in the very structure of the building, not in steel or concrete, but in culture. The janitor and his son entered, as they always had, quietly, early, respectfully. But the moment they stepped through the doors, they were no longer invisible. A receptionist who once barely lifted her head now stood to greet them with a warm smile. Security guards nodded with respect, one even stepping forward to hold the elevator. No one asked for their ID. No one blocked their path. Word had traveled faster than policy. Eyes that used to pass over them now lingered, not out of scrutiny, but recognition. The janitor wore the same uniform, neatly pressed, but his posture was subtly different. Not proud and a boastful wages lighter, more grounded. His son walked beside him, hands in his jacket pocket, gaze moving across the walls he'd memorized 100 times. They were headed to the top floor today, summoned not for cleaning duty, but for something else entirely. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, it wasn't a personal assistant who greeted them. It was the CEO herself. She stood waiting, alone, a hand extended not as a formality, but as a gesture of sincere welcome. She led them down the corridor, past conference rooms, still buzzing with the aftermath of yesterday's success, past tech leads and senior advisors who all paused their conversations to glance with quiet admiration. In the boardroom, now calm and bright with morning sun, the meeting was short and personal. The CEO spoke first, explaining how deeply the event had impacted not just their company's success, but their values. She turned to the janitor and told him plainly he was being offered a new position, not out of charity, but out of respect. A facilities supervisor with oversight over safety systems and a voice in building operations. A role with dignity, a role earned. The janitor was stunned. He'd never asked for recognition, but he accepted, not for himself, but because he knew it meant something more for people like him, for workers who were always present yet never seen. Then came the offer for the boy. It wasn't just a scholarship. It was access. mentorship from the company's top engineers, a seat in every advanced workshop, customized learning pathways, a standing invitation to shadow innovation teams. They didn't want to mold him, they wanted to support what he was already becoming. The CEO made one thing clear: his gift didn't belong to them, it belonged to him, but they wanted to be a part of his journey. He didn't speak much, just nodded, wide-eyed somewhere between shy and thoughtful, as if part of him was still unsure if this was real. The next few days transformed the building, not physically, but in how people behaved, in how they thought. For years, roles had been divided by title and badge color. Now, people started talking across those invisible walls. Engineers started eating lunch with custodians. IT teams began greeting the overnight cleaning crew by name. An intern designed a new internal app where anyone regardless of department could suggest improvements. The company didn't issue a press release. The CEO refused to let the moment become a PR stunt. No staged photos, no headlines, but the story escaped anyway. As real stories do, it became a whisper shared over coffee, a lesson in meetings, a reference point in emails. Schools reached out asking for the boy to speak. Tech blogs wrote articles on his code logic. But he remained quiet, grounded. He didn't want to be a mascot. He wanted to keep learning. And in the quiet of the building, after all the recognition and meetings, he went back to what he loved, sitting at a screen, exploring new problems, losing himself in possibilities. The janitor, now supervisor, changed uniforms, but not his habits. He still swept corners no one noticed. He still smiled at the cafeteria staff. Still walked his son home in the evenings, asking him what he learned that day. Other janitors began holding their heads a bit higher, not because of a title, but because someone like them had helped save a giant. One quietly told the new HR manager that his daughter loved coding too. Another started leaving simple puzzles near the break rooms for anyone to solve. An executive assistant picked one up, got hooked, and started a company-wide puzzle challenge. Slowly, imperceptibly, the company culture evolved. People who were once background became voices. Ideas surfaced from places no one expected. Productivity rose not from pressure, but from unity. One afternoon, in a classroom converted into a learning lab on the second floor, the boy sat across from a veteran engineer who once led the server division. The man asked, humbly, "How did you know where to start?" The boy shrugged, looked down, then smiled. "I just kept watching. You all were loud. The system was quiet. I listened to the quiet." That phrase traveled across departments. Listen to the quiet. It became a slogan not printed on mugs, but whispered when tough choices came up. A reminder that value isn't always in the loudest voices, but sometimes in the quiet, unnoticed ones. As the season changed and months passed, the office tower stood the same from the outside, but inside, it had been rewired not just in code, but in conscience. Not just in process, but in people. And one evening, as dusk painted the windows orange and purple, a final shot would capture the building from a distance, lights flickering. In rooms where innovation now carried a different energy, a voice would rise, soft, reflective, and full of quiet reverence. Sometimes, brilliance doesn't wear a suit. Sometimes, it carries a mop and dreams. And with that, the screen would fade to black. The story didn't end with a launch. It ended with a lesson. One the company would carry forward. One the boy had always known. Brilliance, after all, belongs to no one group. It lives in curiosity, in silence, in shadows, and sometimes, it walks beside a mop bucket, waiting to be seen, waiting to be heard, waiting to shine.